Apple and their M1 chips, the Apple Silicon, are really interesting. But there are certain software products where it is quite interesting to see whether or not those are actually working on said product. And now I finally have a chance to have a MacBook Air of the M1 lineup right here. And in this video, I want to specifically tackle the topic of how does OBS, the streaming software, recording software, and much more actually perform on this type of machine, and would I use it for production-ready systems? Now, generally speaking, transforming the environment and now using ARM-based systems is really interesting. However, it can bring up a whole lot of complications. But Apple is really good at making that transition relatively easy. They've done so with the Power Mac or Power PC transition to Intel already, and now they're pretty much doing the exact same thing, just going to ARM 64-bit with the Apple Silicon chips. Before using only Intel, now having both at the same time, and over the next 1 or 2 years probably going to transferring everything over to their own Apple Silicon. Now, we've seen a whole lot of different reviews in different areas like video editing and other topics of how these M1 chips actually outperform some of the top tier Intel machines. However, I want to, as I've mentioned, look at how live streaming functions on the M1 chipset and if it is usable. Now, the reason why I have this MacBook Air here is because my partner is doing a whole lot of yoga class live streams or live sessions on Zoom, and before she was using a heavy old big Windows laptop which was barely able to keep up. And at some point there was an update to OBS or some system software, and we had to change from using 1080p for the webcam and live streaming to downgrading it to now only 720p. And then also with a travel trip coming up, at some point she had to upgrade, and I was on the lookout on what would be a good situation or what would be a good machine. And I actually found the M1 chips or M1 MacBooks be very, very interesting. I myself am a huge fan of Apple products. I have been using solely Apple computers for about 10 or almost 12 years now, something like that. And I have a 2017 MacBook Pro 15-inch model here. Now, the machine that I have here is the Apple MacBook Air M1 with 16 gigabytes of RAM and the 8 cores of CPU. So this is the upgraded version, which is basically the top of the line MacBook Air 13-inch model that you can get as of right now. Now, the reason why the MacBook Air was chosen over the MacBook Pro was one, that it is a little bit cheaper than the MacBook Pro version, and the MacBook Pro version only has fans in it and a little bit more battery life. And in videos that we watched before she actually made the purchasing decision to go with the MacBook Air, we found that even in heavy duty work, like for example video editing, the performance difference to the MacBook Air or between the MacBook Air and the Pro was relatively minimal. So here we are with the MacBook Air, and we have OBS running on this machine already. Now, the great thing is that the people behind OBS or the open source community around OBS actually was relatively quick to make adjustments and make this software work on the M1 platform. Now, granted that right now we are about 1 year into the transition from Intel machines to the M1 lineup, so there was a bunch of time to actually update this type of software. However, what I wanted to see is how does it actually perform and how does it hold up when you use it for longer periods of time. The settings that I use for streaming here are the Apple Hardware Encoder and 6000 bitrate and also a maximum bitrate of 6000 with a keyframe interval of 2. And I have tested this with different resolutions, namely 1080p and 4K with 30 frames per second as well as 60 frames per second. Now, my tests revealed once again the reason why I choose the Apple Hardware Encoder instead of the FFmpeg or the CPU-based encoding. And that is that with the hardware encoding, these types of machines, specifically the MacBook Pros or MacBook Airs in this case, are much more performant than using the CPU version. You are going to get a little bit of a lesser quality signal. So if you can use your CPU for the encoding, or you only have this computer doing this one task, task of encoding and you don't want to do anything else on that machine, then go ahead and use the CPU encoding to the best setting possible that is specific to your machine. However, in my case and also with my partner, there are other programs running in the background. The machine is not just used for the live stream, and a little bit of a quality hit in terms of the video or image quality is okay when we still have the performance to go further. Now, my tests essentially showed that these settings that I show here, the Apple VT-H264 hardware encoder combined with the 6000 bitrate as well as the maximum bitrate and a full HD with 30 frames per second was working completely flawlessly. When I start a encoding with that and I start streaming, there are absolutely no dropped frames, no skipped frames, nothing. Now that experience is not the same for all the different settings. For example, if you choose 4K 60, even with the Apple hardware encoder, you end up skipping frames a whole lot. Then if you go down to 30 frames per second with 4K and still use the Apple hardware encoder, you will get a result that probably works really well. However, if you want to have a stable or reliable signal, I would go down to at least 1080p with 60 frames per second. And in my personal case, and also with my partner, we use 30 frames per second in 1080p because that's totally enough for the things that we do here in the studio, as well as for her with her yoga live stream classes. However, if you choose the software encoder, the X264 version, then the story is a little bit different. You can do the 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second in full HD. However, if you go up to 4K, then you start dropping frames even at 30 frames per second, and not to mention at 60 frames per second, of course, as well. And all of those software encoder tests with the X264 encoder were done with the preset very fast. Now, of course, if you go up in ultra fast mode and all of those things, you might be able to squeeze out more in terms of frames per second or in terms of resolution. However, then you might as well just go with the Apple hardware encoder because you are going to go down the rabbit hole of degrading the image quality and the encoding with also using those faster presets. I tried these settings with different setups, with a desktop capture as well as a camera capture. I also used a cam link as an external camera so that was also additional work for the laptop. Now, of course, the MacBook Air here does not have any fans built in whatsoever. So if it is going to heat up, then at some point it will start throttling and at some point might even start dropping frames. However, in the use case for my partner with 1080p 30 frames per second yoga classes that she's doing through OBS with one camera and a little bit of graphics overlay and also a bit of audio processing, that has never been an issue thus far. Now, would I choose the MacBook Air for a full-on production setup if you want to do a live stream for events or stuff like that? And there I would have to say absolutely I would not. I would most likely go either with the Mac Mini, the M1 version, or the MacBook Pro at least, because that also has the inbuilt fans. So in case the CPU starts to get a little bit warmer, then there is an option to actually cool it down a little more with the help of those CPU fans. Now you could also use one of those fan plates at the bottom with the MacBook Air, for example. So you can buy one of those on Amazon, put it underneath, hook it up to a USB port or something like that to give it a little bit of power, and then you have basically fans for the MacBook Air without having the fans inside of the device. That of course is not going to be the same, however it might help when you have those kind of issues with a MacBook Air that you already own. Now I have to say I am absolutely blown away by the performance the M1 lineup brings to the table, especially for the price point that we have seen now. I will probably do more tests throughout the next few weeks and months before eventually also upgrading my own laptop to a M1 version or M1X or whatever the version will be called at that point down the line. I do so much video work that for me it is absolutely worth it to wait to get that bigger computer, despite also having been quite intrigued by the M1 Mac Mini specifically for my desk setup in the last half year, but as of right now I'm pretty happy that I have waited out that kind of a jump. Now, I am glad my partner is now using this computer in comparison to the huge bulky Windows computer she was using before. And I'm also happy that I was able to make this test and get to know the environment of the M1 Mac lineup a little better. Now, if you found this video helpful or entertaining, I would appreciate a thumbs up. That always helps out a lot. If you have any questions about this stuff, then you can leave those in the comment section down below, and I'm gonna try to answer you there, but you can also join my Discord server for a conversation. Now, with all that said, I hope you have an amazing day, have fun streaming on your M1 Macs, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao!